Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with another wonderful layered stencil set from my Prettier Plaques series, part of my new cookie stencil line. This one's just in time for Valentine's Day, and it's my I'm Yours stencil set. As a reminder, all of my Prettier Plaques sets are designed to make plaque cookies more gorgeous than ever by eliminating the interaction that typically occurred between the backgrounds and the messages on plaque cookies. I've eliminated that by introducing a unique masking stencil, masking piece if you will, that leaves an area empty for messages in the middle of these plaque cookies. So let's get started on what you'll need for this particular project. First, a close-up view of where we're headed. Here's the stencil applied to a heart and a more classic plaque shape. So you don't necessarily need to stick strictly to plaques, of course. In this particular video, I'm going to show you a couple twists on what I've shown in previous videos. Namely, I'm going to show you how the stencils all work together, of course, but I'm going to show you shading techniques using petal dusts and our shading stencil, and also how to create royal icing embellishments like the bow you just saw on that cookie, not as transfers, but by icing directly onto the cookie. So, as far as what you'll need my I'm Yours stencil set that comes in a package that looks something like this. Within the package, let me just point this out again, there are detailed instructions, very similar to what I'm going through here about how to create layered looks. This is just one particular way that I create layered looks that are on these instructions. What I'm providing in the videos are lots of neat and interesting twists to allow you to get creative and innovative with these sets. But I do encourage you to save this and read it over if these videos aren't enough. Here's what the I'm Yours set actually looks like. As a reminder, it's got a really lavish background stencil. I particularly love this one because it's a half and half. It's half flowers and half dots, so there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you rotate it, how much exposure you give it on the cookie. You can get a whole range of different backgrounds out of this one stencil. We've got our shading stencil, which creates a little shade or shadow around the message, and this shading stencil is nothing but the negative piece that's left over after we take out the masking piece. The masking piece is what's going to leave a little space for our message on the cookie when we come around to stenciling it. And then lastly, we have a frame stencil that nicely frames the message that goes wherever you choose to plant it on the cookie. We're going to mix this up a little bit by bringing in one other stencil set. This is from one of my baby stencil sets. We're going to be extracting this little bow as an embellishment. So that's the little twist we're going to introduce here. Of course, you need smoothly iced cookies that are completely dry all the way through. We're going to be applying some pressure as we stencil, so we don't want to smush the underlying icing. We need stencil frames, aka Stencil Genie, to hold the larger background stencils in place. Optionally, I sometimes weight down the Stencil Genie even further on the corners with wood blocks so that the stencil really lies flush against the cookie. This is particularly important if you have edges that are quite curved and really roll off the edge. The extra weighting will allow the stencil to sit that much flatter. Smaller weights, these are magnets that I use for holding down the masking piece. This is a 3-color project using airbrush colors, of course. Violet, red, and pink. We've got an airbrush. We'll talk more in another video about my recommended airbrush and how to maintain it and use it properly. But I am working with a Badger brand brush today. You'll need airbrush cleaner. This is available online, also on stencilease.com, for cleaning out that airbrush and keeping it functioning properly without clogging. A bowl or some other receptacle for getting rid of spent airbrush coloring if you can't get it back into the container. And then lastly, for our embellishments for that bow, we're going to be using some thick purple royal icing, clings to the spoon. And for the shading element, we're going to be shading with a little dry petal dust and a dry brush, also in a purple color. I'm set up for airbrushing. I'm going to airbrush this entire cookie except for the royal icing bow that we're going to put on at the end. However, please note that all of these stencils work equally well with both royal icing and airbrushing. The key is if you're going to use them in a layered way, one on top of the other or after the other, you just want to use royal icing in your last step so that every other stencil that lays down before lays down flush against the surface of the cookie. That's one of the most important things with stenciling, to make sure there's no gap between the stencil and the cookie. I've got my background in the Stencil Genie, which helps to keep it flat, but my cookie's a little low in the middle. You can see it's not sitting flush there. When I tap it, it's kind of bouncing up and down. But I'm hoping that when I put the masking piece on, I'm going to center my message about here. I'm actually not going to center it because I want to show a lot of that flower and a lot of that flower. I'm going to put a little off center. And I'm hoping when I weigh it down, it'll weigh down this part that's somewhat lifting here. And it's not entirely. So what I'm going to do here with this area that's still lifted is when I spray it, I'm just going to come in with my trussing needle and make sure this is, flat down when I spray in this zone just by moving my trussing needle around. Before we start spraying anything on the cookie, it's nice to test on paper. I originally thought I was going to go with a real springy, kind of untraditional Valentine's palette, bright purple, bright pink, and springy greens. And that looks pretty, but then the traditional side of me took over and decided to go with the palette you see in front of you, which is a little bit richer in jewel tones, kind of a ruby red, purples, and pinks. Let's test the pink and the flow of the airbrush. It looks good. I had some older colors in here previously, so I wanted to make sure they weren't coming out. And since that's the lifted area, I'm going to immediately start by pressing that down with my trussing needle. You could use your finger, but you want to keep your hands out of the airflow because they'll get covered with airbrush coloring. And then close to the cookie, so that I really concentrate in those areas that I want pink and don't get much into the center. Now the closer I airbrush, the more focal my spray is. If I were to pull my airbrush back up, I'd get pink all over the cookie, and I don't want that. I want it in very limited areas, which is why I'm spraying so close and with a low pressure and a low touch of the gun. Hardly pulling back on my airbrush trigger right now. Okay, we're gonna add the red next. I'm just spraying it through to make sure it's coming all the way through and there's no more pink in there. And I'm gonna do all the dots and leaves in red, leaving the centers of the flowers for purple. So again, pretty close overhead so I don't flow into the pink areas I just did too much. And so I want to do all of these leaves in red as well. We want to get up here with red. Let's see how I go off the edge just to make sure I get around the rounded corner of the cookie there. Okay, I think I'm going to go over the dots one more time just to make sure I got them. I feel like it's sometimes harder to get the airbrush coloring down into those tiny spaces. So I usually go over them twice. Touch of red right up there. And I think that's good. And now I'll pick up the purple for the centers of the flowers only. And maybe to outline some of the veins in the middle of the big leaves. Still got red in there, so I've got to push that all through to make sure the purple's coming out before I start. It's looking like a very dark, funny purple because it's mixed with red. So this may be where a little airbrush cleaner can expedite the process of cleaning it out. My colors are primarily water-based. They're going to blend more than some other coloring type, airbrush coloring types. They're alcohol-based, have a higher concentration of alcohol in them. Those tend to there tends to be less mixing with those types of colors. I like the mixing effect, so I often use the water-based colors. Okay, now I'm going to get the centers and back off a little bit because it's pooling up. I don't want to get too much of the pink area. Here I tend to lift up rather than roll off. In most other cases I roll the stencil to the side because it's just hard to roll the genie to the side. So I'll lift up as well as I can. And I do that to try to minimize any smudging of any coloring that might be still wet underneath. And that looks just great. I've got quite a bit of wetness here, so I might have to give this a little bit of drying time before I move on to the next step, or I might smudge that. I'm going to take a little break from the airbrushing to use my shading stencil to create a shading effect in the void created by the masking piece. In contrast to my shading in other videos where I used airbrush coloring, I'm going to be using a dry petal dust, like so, and a dry soft brush to spread it on. And that'll give a nice subtle look like so. But you want to make sure you don't get it on any wet food coloring because wherever it commingles with the wet, it'll intensify and get really dark. Got quite a lot going down at first, but I'll smudge it around the whole perimeter and hopefully most of it will be used up or blended in by the time I'm done with this. So I think that's enough shading for me. There's a little bit of extra dust there, which I'm just going to knock off the cookie once I get the shading stencil off. I've got a little extra on there, which I'm just going to knock off by tapping it off or taking the brush and knocking it off here as well. And I'm going to use purple again for the frame, which I believe is what I have in my gun. Before I shoot it on the cookie again, I like to test on paper. In sitting, sometimes food coloring can dry in the gun and you don't want to get a big pulse of food coloring on your cookies. So better to do it on paper towel. It's flowing nicely. I'm going to start light and go around twice just to get it as dark or as close to as dark as the centers of my flowers, which were pretty intense. I think that looks good. Now I am going to hold on to the stencil as I remove magnets so that I don't slide the stencil and potentially smudge coloring, and then just roll it off. And that looks great. And you can see the nice shadow just within the frame. I'm going to move on to the last step, which is the message. And here I think I do want to do it in red, so I'm going to swap colors yet one more time. And I'm waiting, see how the stencil's kind of bowing in the middle? Sort of bending to the sides. You could use the Stencil Genie, that might help flatten it, but I find that if I just get the magnets close enough, I get the flattest result that way. Just dumping out some of that purple, getting some red in there. Now it may take me a little longer to flush through the purple to get to the red because we went from very dark to not so dark. Still a little purpley red. So I probably would have been wise, you can see how dark it is compared to there. It probably would have been wise to give that a fuller cleaning with airbrush coloring. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Yeah, much brighter. See, there it is mixed with purple, there it is red. So a little bit of cleaning is sometimes necessary when going from dark to less dark or light. Directly overhead now on the cookie. Gradually applying color as always. That looks good. So holding the stencil down, taking the magnets off, and then kind of rolling it away. Ta-da! So this cookie that I just stenciled looks gorgeous as it is. You don't need to do anything with it, but I do want to demonstrate the versatility of my stencils. This stencil here is a frame stencil from one of my baby sets, which you will find on stencilease.com. And I just want to extract that central bow and put it on the cookie. And there are a couple ways to do it. As a reminder, we made royal icing transfers by stenciling through my stencils onto parchment paper when we did the piece cookie. I made some snowflakes and then we attached them that way. And that's exactly what I did to create these bows. I just spread this onto purple icing through this onto parchment paper, let it dry, and then I'm able to lift them off and I can place them. And that creates an effect that has some dimensionality to it, which is kind of nice. So that's one way to do it. I'm going to go ahead and complete that look on this cookie, but then I'm going to show you a separate way of applying the icing directly to the cookie. So I'm just going to put this down with a touch of white royal icing, so if any peeks out, it's less likely to show. Maybe let it overlap the frame a little bit. I think that looks good. And then I'm going to take some coordinating red royal icing and just top it off with a little red dot in the center. This is my icing of beadwork consistency, which forms a nice rounded dot on its own because it's relatively loose. And that looks beautiful, and it lifts off the cookie a little bit. So by contrast, I want to show you how to apply royal icing directly onto the cookie without creating transfers, which is possible too. It's a little tricky with this frame piece because the rest of the frame comes very close to the bow, and if I were just to spread purple icing over this, I'd probably pick up some elements of this frame that I don't want. So what I'm going to do is actually mask off the areas I don't want to pick up with a little painter's tape. So here I've just successfully masked off the bow, just the portion I want to capture. Actually, I think this piece can come in a little bit closer. And that'll just prevent me from overspreading into other areas that I don't want on my cookie. I tend to prefer when I'm working with royal icing not to use a Stencil Genie, particularly if I'm using a big spatula, just so I have freer clearance and more room to move the spatula. Start by just applying a very little bit of thick royal icing. You'll notice it clings to the spatula. The thicker it is, the less likely it is to underflow the stencil. So one of my top tips for stenciling is to use a very thick royal icing for stenciling. And then I take a clean spatula and just give it one nice swipe so it's all flat and lying flush to the stencil. And then keeping a finger on it, just roll back the stencil and you've got a nice little bow stenciled directly on the cookie without going through the process of making transfers. So I think I'm just going to finish that off with one single red dot, and it's just perfect. So before you dash off to try my I'm Yours stencil, which is one of my favorites from my new Prettier Plaques series, I want to remind you of one other very cool thing, and that is my Stencil of the Month Club. Each month, about mid-month, we'll be announcing a surprise stencil set or combination of stencils that you can purchase on stencilease.com. And if you subscribe to my Stencil of the Month Club, you will be able to get those surprise stencils for 20% off normal retail value. So something that would normally retail for about 20 bucks, you'll be able to get for $15.99. And it just so happens that our Stencil of the Month for February is this very lovely love set. It's got a similar leaf background to the I'm Yours, but it's got a heart motif at the top. And it's got a very different masking and shading stencil, and of course a very, very different message. So be looking forward to that. I have other Valentine's Day stencils already on the site, so I encourage you to jump on over there and get shopping. Till next video, live sweetly and happy Valentine's Day.